Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezin. This week, we look at economics and regulations, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. In the second half of our show, we'll be joined by John Cochran, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, who's perhaps better known by his blog moniker, The Grumpy Economist. Up first, Fred Smith, founder and past president of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, takes a look back at the coevolution of the modern industrial enterprise and the progressive regulatory state. Fred, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Bill. Could be fun.
Fred, I asked you on the show to give us some perspective on the transformation of American political ideology, beginning with the late Industrial Revolution to the rise of the progressive movement in the first half of the 20th century. The tension between free markets and central planning that emerged as the key conflict in American politics remains very much with us today, which is why it's important to study. Paint us a picture of the American economy as it exploded during what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age.
Well, America had been, of course, an agricultural society. The Industrial Revolution quickly migrated to America, actually very shortly in the early 19th century. We were already in many areas ahead of England. But initially, those were small enterprises, localized, regionalized. But as the railroads and other activities began to knit America together, those blew up into much larger enterprises. We went from the mom-and-pop shops, the small business conveyance, to the massive enterprises that became demonized as big business, as the robber baron enterprises, the malefactors of great wealth, and so forth.
It was also the great age of invention.
Great age of invention, and to some extent, of course, still is, but the individualism of America had always made it possible for us to see what other countries were doing, adapting it, modifying it, innovating it. And we were innovating everywhere. I'm not sure which exactly starts where. Did the assembly line start here or with Henry Ford? But all these pieces were putting together because Americans everywhere had little machine shops, and they would try new things, and some of them worked, and eventually some of them became very large enterprises.
And living standards were also advancing quite rapidly.
Living standards, well, America had actually never been a very poor country. Even in our colonial period compared to parts of England, we were quite well off. But by the late 19th century, we were, by all historical standards, affluence. But of course, affluence always brings about it with the view, well, if we're this wealthy, why is there any poverty? Why is there any depression and so forth?
That's a question that stays with us. Let's get into some individual stories, which I always find so fascinating. Every school kid knows about the Transcontinental Railroad and the Golden Spike at Promontory Point. But few remember that that railroad was built with massive federal subsidies and then went bankrupt. Compare that to the story of James Hill and the Great Northern Railroad, which you'll never learn about in public school.
No, it's a very interesting story. Burton Folsom has written about that masterfully. But it's a question of America always had a Hamiltonian and Alexander Hamilton element, and that always led to national investments and national projects of great interest. And so we always had a certain tendency to think if something was really good, some politician would want to subsidize it. Ports and harbors was one. The railroads were the big one. We just gave away massive quantities of land. Based on every mile of track you built, you got a section of land. No need to point out that that incentive does not encourage you to draw straight lines. So we ended up with curlicue railroads going, and also it doesn't encourage you to think whether when you finally finish it, there's going to be enough traffic at those various locations to justify an economically viable railroad. So we built railroads quickly. We certainly expanded the railroad network faster than we might have otherwise, like we did the federal highway system much later. But we did it with vastly greater costs than we needed and with far less economic sustainability to the system. The alternative was James Hill, a true entrepreneur who did not turn to government for work. When he built his railroads, he built them efficiently. The bridges actually lasted a long time. He built them where he anticipated by the time he got there, the traffic would justify the railroad. He built it in response not to political incentives, but in response to consumer incentives. And his railroad was the only one of the major railroads that did not go bankrupt. Of course, for that, he was not received well within the intellectual tradition or even within the railroad industry, but he did build a railroad that actually ran on time and worked.
And was forgotten by historians.
Well, not all historians, but yes, he definitely is not the story. The story you hear about is the Stanfords and the Lelands and the great robber barons in the truest sense, the cronyist, who looked to Washington and the state capitals for investment capital, not to the market.
Now, thanks to mechanization, agriculture also went through a revolution in that same period, with crop yields going through the roof just as demand for farm labor began sagging. What political stresses did this cause?
Well, whenever people have to change locations, societies are always conservative. And the great and the troubling part of innovative societies is what's called creative destruction. Mm-hmm. We basically are always displacing existing technologies, existing work skills. And yet, no society in the history of mankind has ever got out of poverty by improving agriculture. It creates opportunities for other things, while at the same time, it's massively increasing the productivity. So in one sense, the farmers are pushed off the land. The other way of putting it is what Marx said. It allows a lot of people to escape the idiocies of rural life. So in fact what happened was America was at the same time making the number of farmers much less needed than before, and at the same time creating massive opportunities in America's burgeoning cities and so forth to give them creative, future-oriented opportunities to do better for themselves and their families.
And there was always a lot of tension between the farmers and the railroads. On the one hand, it created vast new markets for the farmer. On the other hand, they were always complaining about rates.
Everybody always complains about rates, and a politicized rate structure, which by that time railroads were facing at the state level and then later on at the national level, is one that always says, well, if I don't like my rates, I'll call my politician. And that means that no matter what your rate is, somebody out there must be getting a different one. Remember, up to this time, price bargaining had been on a one-on-one basis. Mm-hmm. You went into your local establishment, you made a deal. This was for the first time when those rates were going to massive numbers of people, and bigger users, more volume, could obviously get price discounts. That was seen as unfair because you didn't see that in the store normally, although of course you did. If you were a major purchaser in a grocery store, you probably did get a better deal. But the point was, it was seen as unfair, unthinkable. Price policies are always hard to understand, and the railroads themselves were exploring. They didn't know what the right price was because they are large. Railroads are not atypical. They have very large fixed costs, and how do you allocate those fixed costs across all of your traffic? Economics does not provide any very clear guidelines to that, so you experiment, and those experiments are seen by those who end up paying somewhat more than others as unfair. The point was rates were dropping during this whole period, just like prices of goods were dropping, but couldn't they have dropped even faster if government got involved? Well, the answer, as we'll learn later, is not true, but it was plausible to some people in the Granger movement, the agrarian movement. In fact, there's a wonderful story about some man in North Dakota. He was run over by a tractor on his farm, and with his dying breath, he looked up to heaven and said, God damn the railroads.
It certainly stayed with our politics of that period. It all came to a head when railroads became the first national business to come under federal control through the Interstate Commerce Commission. I mean, the public was sold on the idea that this was to protect consumers and farmers, but what actually happened?
Well, it's a story that's been repeated many, many times in government's attempt to improve markets. The first stage was they passed some laws, vaguely worded, and gave the emerging Interstate Commerce Commission a lot of powers, which nobody in government knew how to operate. There were some wonderful quotes about what do government bureaucrats know about running a railroad. So they had to lean on business to give them information. So the railroaders basically were partners in setting up these initial regulations. That led to what is often called the regulatory capture phenomenon. Well, who else are you going to turn to when you don't know anything about it except people who are actually doing it? But of course, that does lead to potential bias and so on. So within a period of time, there was pressure to the ICC. Be men, stand up and force those railroads to be more fair, etc. And of course, other political interests, the shipper interests, all of whom wanted lower rates, could use that populist indignation and the political desire for looking like heroes to gain influence over the regulatory agency. So the railroads had a brief honeymoon period where they did maybe gain a few little things here and there, but very shortly they became the payee rather than the beneficiary. And the railroads actually by the 1920s were in a 100-year going out of business sale.
Some things never change.
No. In fact, it does illustrate, though, the naivete in a way of business. Business always sees the short-term benefits of, look, government's there, it's hard to fight it. They'll give us a little bit, so we make a deal with them. But a deal with government is not a deal with an economic partner. You can actually sign contracts with each other. You can't sign contracts with government. There are no free subsidies and no free benefits. And industry has learned some of that, but that's really still a challenge. There's always a few businessmen who think, I know enough about all this, so my deal will fix. It never does.
So, Fred, we're discussing the Gilded Age and some of the great entrepreneurs and industrialists of that time. And, of course, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller were surely more famous than Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg in their day. They transformed the steel and oil industries. The economic results were felt across the nation. How were these brilliant entrepreneurs and spectacularly generous philanthropists transformed into robber barons in the public mind?
Well, they were successful. They characterized the heads of what had been demonized as big business. We hadn't had big businesses before. We'd had localized businesses, and these new giants emerged on the economic and political horizon. They scared people. It's always easy to scare people in politics, and it happens a lot. More than one economist has pointed out what we don't understand about business practices we assume represent anti-consumer, anti-populist positions. And since there was lots we didn't understand about the management of these brand new enterprises, there was a lot businessmen didn't understand about them. There were always cases where you could make a case. Why did they do this? Why did they do that? You see this now with the Internet. Why is the Internet charging this way? Why are they slowing and so forth? Those confusions are so easily transferred because, in all honesty, markets are discovery processes. And one of the most important discovery processes is how should I array my charges across all the potential users in order to be an economically sustainable industry. That was hard then, but those were pioneering efforts, so they were demonized. The point was they were having to invent everything. I mean, Rockefeller had to invent the gas can. He had to invent the tank car. The steel industry had to open up coal and iron mines. Those were all activities that were new to the companies. They knew how to do certain things, but they didn't know how to backward integrate or forward integrate. And they had to learn how to do that. Later on, the aluminum industry had to actually start making pots and pans because the wartime economy had bought up lots of airplane bodies for bombers and fighters. But after the war, there was no market for aluminum products. So aluminum foil is still produced by the big companies. Nothing else in the metallurgical industry is produced by the intermediate metallurgical firm. But that indicates, again, how easy it is to look at an economy in static terms. Would these be rates and processes we'd like to see forever? No. Markets are dynamic. They're always changing everything. And understanding a dynamic process is something economists certainly don't do very well. And it's certainly politicians do, if anything, even worse. And that was why these groups became demonized. Even though, historically, not only did they create lots of wealth, far more wealth than they could use for themselves, and, of course, not just their personal wealth, which is sometimes we confuse Bill Gates with. The real wealth they created was making metals cheap enough for everybody to have utensils and cars and everything else. And the automobile invented in Europe, but it was Henry Ford who put the world on wheels, who democratized the mobility that has proven so critical to modern society.
Along with a tremendous rise in the general standard of living, the success of the Industrial Revolution brought a new kind of economic inequality as successful entrepreneurs amassed these enormous and conspicuous fortunes that you talk about. What makes the resentment that comes from market success so much more powerful than, say, age-old resentments against hereditary nobility or modern resentments against successful actors and sports figures?
Well, I think in part it comes from our cultural heritage, going all the way back to the tribal prehistory of mankind. In an egalitarian tribe, it's always dangerous to have anyone stick their head up. It's all for one, one for all. And you're basically forced into a kind of don't do too much better, because if you do, you're going to have to share with everyone else. The sharing society in that age had a much more pejorative term than it does today. And the idea that tribal egalitarianism, which is totally incompatible with modern success, focuses on static. An egalitarian society never has innovators, because innovators are going to do somewhat better, even if it's only in terms of prestige. So you always have that resentment. What happened in the late 19th century, there were some dramatic differences between the wealthiest and the average, and intellectuals, progressives, were able to take that difference in wealth and turn it into inequity. So remember, they'd already demonized the industries themselves. Easy enough then to transfer that demonization from the industry to the robber baron captains of industry.
You mentioned the progressives. The start of the 20th century saw the rise of a new class of intellectuals in America, many of which took their inspiration from Otto von Bismarck in Germany. Tell us about that.
We all understand ideas have consequences, and intellectuals are the ones who create and craft and disseminate ideas. Intellectuals historically had always been around, but they've been small forces. They had to depend on bending a knee to the Lord, the king, the duke, the cardinals. For the first time in a wealthy society, intellectuals could stand on their own. They could actually make enough money to be an intellectual without being dependent on anyone. They became independent, and that independence allowed them to be much more radical, much more aggressive, and yet they wanted prestige, they wanted honor. And how do you do that? You pander to the values of your time. And you care about money. I care about the higher things in life, the psychological motivation. And of course, anyone who thinks for a short period realizes that a political economy will have many more advisory jobs, both in government and the private sector. So you do well economically, you do well psychologically. It's a real temptation, and most intellectuals, as many have pointed out, are in fact in favor of bigger government. True today, was true back in the 19th century.
Well, why the attraction of Bismarck?
Well, the world was going through this whole period of romanticism about let's all do it together, a sort of return to tribalism. Everywhere in the world was going through this period. Now, the middle class existed. Then the intellectual parts wanted to see more power with the people, as they put it. Let's do it together for us rather than for you. Self-interest is selfish, et cetera, et cetera. While this was going on in the late 19th century, Bismarck in Germany was creating the German nation state. He was putting together the pieces of Germany, and to glue it together, he created the concept of nationalism, and with nationalism, you had the creation of the first welfare regulatory state, and used lots of intellectuals to hold it all together, to staff it, to be the bureaucrats. American intellectuals had always looked to Europe for their guidance. I mean, after all, they were more mature, they were more there than in America. So they pilgrimaged to Europe and then pilgrimaged to the leading state, Germany at the time, and they came back to America with stars in their eyes. By God, in Germany, we're seeing the creation of the future, and not only that, but intellectuals there get prestige, get honor, get money too, and they wanted it in America. And they actually imported, Gifford Pinchot, who later on was appointed by Teddy Roosevelt to be the first chief of the Forest Service, was a leading progressive at the time, and his whole idea was all forests ought to be managed for national interest. Interestingly enough, at that time, the national interest was that he thought that private people were too slow to cut down trees.
You know, you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. He picked up the progressive baton with a passion and was probably the first president to declare war on American business. How did he use this to amass federal power?
This is an interesting interplay between politics and intellect. Herb Crowley, who had been one of the American intellectuals, prominent ones who was influenced by all these, wrote a book, The Promise of America, and it had amazing influence. Roosevelt read it, Crowley talked to it, and Roosevelt saw a way of becoming the great intellectual as well as political leader. He fell right into the trap, and of course, the rhetoric is wonderful. I'm for the people, not the malefactors of great wealth and so forth, and waged war on big business, basically. The antitrust laws were ones that he wanted to push, which is a form of national industrial policy, the old Hamiltonian, let the government direct the economy. And Roosevelt really was America's first truly progressive, collectivist, centralized national planning type president. He was laying the groundwork for a much larger government, and of course, that laid the groundwork for Woodrow Wilson to come in after the breakup of the Republican Party. And Woodrow Wilson was an intellectual. He had been the first PhD president in America's history and came in and had a perfect plan for what he was going to do to America.
Wilson's been much in the news lately as his legacy is being re-examined in light of his racist attitudes and support for things like eugenics. Part and parcel of the progressive plan for better living included breeding better people. Talk to us about that a bit.
Well, after all, if you believe that the world is best run by giving much power to the best and the brightest, that's hard if you have a lot of not so bright, not so brilliant people around. So the idea was, let's get those people out so we can breed the Ubermensch who can run America, can create heaven on earth. We saw how far that went later on in Germany, starting off with the roots of Bismarck. But it was happening in America to some extent. The eugenics movement was very powerful in America. Everyone knew, all the science, all the best and the brightest knew that we had allowed America's genetic pool to deteriorate, all these immigrants, all of these different type of people. We needed a world that was designed to be better in all ways, and one, of course, would be the new man. We were going to invent a new man. That led to family planning in a more benign form. That has been omitted from the history books, too.
Yep.
Those who believe in government doing everything have a lot of things to answer for. The most dangerous one is that they don't talk about it once they realize how horrible some of their utopian dreams work out in reality.
Fred, after so many years running the think tank you founded, you've achieved elder statesman status and are focusing on a passion project you call the Center for Advancing Capitalism. What are its goals?
Well, it's essentially to regain for capitalism the legitimacy its achievements merit. Nothing has done more to lift the billions of people out of poverty we've seen over the last century. Nothing has done more to mobilize mankind's creative skills and energies into addressing human needs. Science in the public interest happened because capitalism linked raw intellectual talent with marketers who could say, that's an interesting idea. Let me see how I can make something that would benefit people, make money. That whole process has been under attack since the progressive era, of course, earlier in other societies. And it's under attack for a large number of reasons, partly because most intellectuals find it more in their self-interest. So those of us who are free market intellectuals need to do more to strategically think about the legitimization challenge. And part of that is we have to find a way of reaching more people. And that, of course, is what business does on a daily basis. Business is in intimate contact with its workers, its customers, its investors, and industry needs to have a narrative, a story about what we've been talking about, how it's done such wonderful things, and those are best crafted by we intellectuals. There's an incredibly important alliance between those of us who can make the intellectual emotive cases for capitalism and those who actually are capitalists and have the ability to promote it and to distribute those information. That alliance, which on the left, of course, is called Baptists and bootleggers and is very powerful, trial lawyers and environmentalists, consumer groups and unions, has been a dramatic way of their advancing a statist agenda. Our challenge, can we create a more virtuous alliance of free market intellectuals and free market businessmen to validate the system that is the basis of modern civilization?
Well, Fred, good luck with it. Thanks for coming on the show, and happy 75th birthday.
Well, it's an important project. Take care. Bye-bye.
That was Fred Smith, past president of CEI, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Ahead, we'll speak with John Cochran, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, otherwise known as the Grumpy Economist. Stay tuned.